All right. Well, good afternoon to you all on the webinar, as well as the folks here in the Titan conference room of the IBM Innovation Center in Foster City, California. Our host, Chris Heckert, who's in the room. We thank you, Chris. Chris, thank you very much for hosting us. And also to all of you who have taken time out of your busy schedules to come out here. And the folks who are online, many of you who are on the East Coast post-dinner, I really appreciate your presence. Every month, my attempt is to bring you a topic pertaining to smart grid, energy efficiency, clean tech, from either a policy perspective, a business process perspective, or from a technology perspective, or any combination thereof. But rather than hearing it from one person repeatedly, I try to bring subject matter experts who can provide you the deep dive into different topics, because the purpose of this forum is educational. And I'll tell you the difference between education and training. Education is about learning the abstract concepts, which then you can translate into tangible things, much like the way someone would teach you how to fish. And then you can take that fishing rod or any kind of device and catch fish with it. So in much the same way in smart grid and clean tech, there's a lot of training going on, which is good. It is needed to understand how specific technologies work. But alongside with that training, there's a need for education so that we can expand the horizons of our production possibility curve with smart grid. You've seen a lot of forecasts about the market for smart grid being so many $1 billion and so many $1 billion. And I've seen fads like that come and go before. I'm a fusion engineer, and I've seen network management come and go. So to avoid smart grid from becoming another statistic in that valley of death, if you take Jeffrey Moore's crossing the chasm concept, education is that savior. It's that ability to look beyond what is available, what is possible now, and to dream innovative ideas and then manifest them. So that would mean the starting of many companies, the development of many new business processes, and pushing the regulators to modify the policies to enable a lot of those new technologies to come to being. So this forum is an attempt to bring out those critical issues, those controversial issues, which, if resolved, can open new doors. And today, the topic at hand, which is demand response and dynamic pricing, has definitely found more than its share of controversy. But there is a silver lining around that cloud, and for that we have the ultimate in optimism in Dr. Ahmad Faruqui, because he has seen the good, the bad, and the ugly when it comes to this concept. And he has experience with enough utilities and regulators and policymakers, not part of like commissions, but like the larger industry, to come up with empirically based observations. So when you hear him today, don't be discouraged. That's his style. Okay? That's just Dr. Ahmad Faruqi's style. But he means well. And I have known Ahmad Faruqui for a very long time and learned that he makes you think. And when you think critically and you evaluate, you come up with answers. And that's what it's all about. So the descriptions of his background and everything you all have in the email, so I'm not going to talk about all his accolades, but Ahmad Faruqui, in the years I've known him, is as close to brilliant as it gets. So with that, Dr. Faruqui.
Thank you very much. I haven't seen the film. I've heard a lot about it, the Clint Eastwood film that you're referring to. Maybe I should see it so I can kind of see where I fit in. Well, thank you very much, Irfan. Thank you all for coming, and thank you for all who are listening through the WebEx. It's certainly a great opportunity, I think, for us to spend a part of this lovely afternoon away from the beautiful weather, locked up inside a conference room, listening to something as incredibly interesting as dynamic pricing. So let me ask those of you who have made the sacrifice, how much of a background do you have in the energy industry, broadly speaking? If you have a few years in the energy industry, just raise your hand so I'll get a sense. Okay, and how many of you have a background specifically in the electric utility industry? Okay, all right. And is anyone in the room an economist who would like to be recognized for being one? in this day and age, it's getting to be quite a rare skill. Well, so what I will do is, as Irfan said, I've been pursuing this topic for a while, around the country and actually around the globe. It's one of those things that just when you think you have gotten it, it slips out of your hand. It's like mercury, or some people say it's like a snake. We don't know which one it is, so we will introduce some of those concepts as we get into the discussion. And I will take about 40, 45 minutes, as you said. So obviously it's a long chunk of time. I don't want you to just wait till the very end to ask your questions. If you have a question, ask it right away. When the slide comes up, if it's even a comment or an objection or a strident objection, however you want to phrase it, just ask it as it occurs to you. But just raise your hand so I'll kind of know where you're at. And for those people who are connected through the WebEx, they will...
you can repeat the question.
Okay, so how will the question arise?
Oh, you will see. We'll bring them.
Oh, okay, all right. So they will come up, then I can just repeat the question.
At the end of your talk.
Okay, all right. I guess one thing I will say is that this question, the question of dynamic pricing, can be interpreted as a struggle. It's an epic struggle that has been going on for as long as I've been in this business. It's always, as I said, something that you almost think you have, and then it slips away. For a long time, the issue was the cost of meters. The meters are very, very expensive, and that kept it from going anywhere for about 2.5 decades. And then there were these breakthroughs with advanced metering infrastructure, and a lot of opportunities beckoned. And then, as we all know, as we read the newspapers, all kinds of issues have come up about health effects, about privacy issues, about cybersecurity issues, and the list is not complete by any means. Just when you think you have addressed all of those, another one pops up. So that has nothing to do with dynamic pricing in a direct sense, but it is the infrastructure. And without that infrastructure, you cannot do dynamic pricing. So ultimately, the two do get intertwined. The reason I mention this is because about a year and a half ago, I believe it was February of last year, February of 2011, when the University Club in San Francisco was the site of an event that actually was called, for some reason that I don't quite remember, the Clash of the Titans. And it featured little me in a debate with another person, well-respected figure in the industry. And that actually has been videotaped. We actually tested our audio with that. We might put it on to just catch a glimpse of what the past was like. But I have to tell you, as I approached this conference room, and I looked at the name of the conference room, it said Titan. So, I mean, I don't know what the deal is, but there's something in the air about dynamic pricing that seems to evoke some ancient Greek mythology. So, not to be overly pessimistic and to try to give you a positive perspective on life, I've got this picture here of a water lily. It has nothing to do with the presentation. It's just a nice picture to look at, to get in the mood. Yes?
Just as a comment, this conference room and all of the other ones on this floor, most of which you cannot see, are actually named after the moons of Jupiter and Saturn. Titan is the largest moon of Saturn.
Oh, okay, okay.
You're safe.
Okay, good, good. All right. So it has a special meaning, the name of the room. All right. So what I will do is I will talk about our energy future, our meaning us all collectively, whether we are commissions or utilities. Ultimately, we are all customers. We are part of society. We are part of Earth, regardless of which country we are in. We share all of that. And we are struggling as we look at our energy future for all the reasons you know. I won't go into the details, but what I'm going to talk about is going to be a challenging energy future. We have a climate change issues. We have issues where India and China, admittedly, they're not growing as fast now as they were growing just a year ago. They will grow again, and that will create limitations for natural resources. They'll create issues for the price of all of the natural resources that we burn in the power plants. The cost of raw materials is going to go up, and so we are looking at inflation in the energy sector, however we look at it. We are looking at shortages, we are looking at climate change, all of which means we have to plan aggressively, or the future will not be the future we want to leave for our children and grandchildren. So that's sort of the metaphor of the energy future, and I will talk about how dynamic pricing can play a part in making that a more attractive future, a more fulfilling future, not only for us, but for the generations to come. So the question arises, what is dynamic pricing, right? And so let's introduce this fictional character, Joe Schmoe. Does he know dynamic pricing? Well, if you ask Joe Schmoe, he'll say he doesn't. Okay? But then there is that play in which Monsieur Jourdain was asked, what is prose? And somebody said to him, prose is what you have been speaking all your life. Okay? So it's that kind of situation. So look at Joe. Joe buys an airline ticket, books a hotel room, rents a car, goes to a Giants game, attends a symphony performance once in a while, goes to see a play, maybe Warhorse playing in San Francisco, or just goes to the farmer's market and tries to buy something that's out of season. He sees prices fluctuate. The automatic functioning of the market, in unregulated markets, especially competitive markets, demand and supply have to be balanced. And that's where dynamic pricing plays a role. And I'll tell you why it does in the next slide. Now, interestingly enough, it doesn't stop with those particular industries. If you ever drive the fast-track lane on I-680, I'm sure some of you have done it, you will see dynamic pricing in action. Okay. You cross the Bay Bridge the last year and a half, you've seen there's a time of use rate on the prices, $6 or $4, depending on when you're crossing it. It's time of use pricing, a form of dynamic pricing. If you've driven into London or Singapore on weekdays, there's a congestion price, £5 or some number like that. Okay. And let's not go to London or Singapore. Let's just go to San Francisco or any of the major cities here. You park your car. There is a meter. And the meter doesn't say I'm a time of use rate, but it is a time of use rate. From 8 to 6, it has a price. In the evenings, it might be free. In the weekend, it might be free. Depends on how congested the area is. And now they're introducing smart parking meters, which are digital, where the price will fluctuate based on the congestion. They're trying it out in San Francisco and Los Angeles. So Joe has seen and experienced dynamic pricing. He just didn't know that it was dynamic pricing. So where does dynamic pricing come in? Well, it's a sine qua non for capital-intensive industries. Lumpy, capital-intensive, costs a lot for them to be idling. Okay. So airlines, they can't afford to have planes that just sit there and don't fly. Same is true for hotels, car rentals, all of those that I listed, theaters, symphonies, the Giants, all those seats are, you could say, short-lived. They're perishable. If the show begins without the seat being sold, they're gone. The revenue is lost. Now, I was at an airport the other day. I travel quite a bit, so I'm always at an airport. But in this instance, it was the Phoenix airport. And I was going actually from San Francisco to Phoenix, and I arrived at the airport. They said the flight's canceled. Even though I got up at 4, et cetera, the flight's canceled. Okay? Now you run around, try to find another place. So the next flight was not until 10. I was concerned my meeting would be delayed. So I found another airline that had a flight leaving at 9. So that would get me there on time. Okay? So I asked the person what the fare would be. He said it would be $600 round trip. I said to Phoenix, $600 round trip, that sounds a lot to me. I said, do you have space available? He said, yes, I do. I said, if I don't fly, how much do you make on that seat? He didn't know why I was asking that. Obviously, he'd make nothing. And I said, so why don't you sell it to me at a reasonable price? My ticket is $300 round trip. Just sell it to me at that. He said, that is the ticket. You don't understand what I'm saying. And then, of course, you can't argue with the ticketing agent. He is who he is. Well, he didn't have the authority to do real dynamic pricing. That's what the problem was. So the plane flew with that seat empty. They earned $0 on it, right? So they were not quite dynamic, right? They were kind of stuck in their ways. But any industry that is capital intensive, the one statistic that they report in their annual reports that they talk to Wall Street proudly about is their load factor. Okay? They want the load factor to be in the high 80s. Now, why is that? Well, because it lowers average cost, because there's no idling capacity sitting there. And by the way, the same is true for consulting firms as well. So I'm sure some of you know what that scenario is. You have to sell and be billable. All those idle hours add up to higher average cost. So any industry that has fixed costs is going to pay attention to dynamic pricing. Now, try to do dynamic pricing with your consultant. That can be a challenge. That can be almost an impossible barrier to cross. But then every industry has its culture and traditions. So the reality is you have a congestion issue with the Bay Bridge, right? It becomes really congested. You have time being wasted. I'm sure you have sat in the parking lot and cursed the bridge. Well, that's where the time of use pricing has been brought in. It has helped improve things. And they're just not doing it dynamically enough. If they were, they'd have better flow. But just imagine the hue and cry. So the problem with dynamic pricing is the economists love the concept. Consumers love the concept when they understand it. But you go to a regulated industry where you have all kinds of interveners and stakeholders, and then you have what they call gridlock. And I'm using that deliberately in this particular instance. We will come to gridlock. So the message of the story is that dynamic pricing ensures that supply is available for high-valued uses, and so if there are some low-value uses, they can be cut because the price acts as a rationing device. Okay? And so if you are a last-minute flyer, you can get a seat to New York and back for $2,000 with dynamic pricing. If dynamic pricing was not there, that seat may not have been available for you. So if you are a vacation flyer, you can get that very low airfare if you fly nighttime or if you fly weekends. Okay? That's the choices that dynamic pricing brings. Now, some people hate it, but the rule is more people are flying. You have to adjust for 9/11, but more people are flying and paying less than they used to before airlines were deregulated, before dynamic pricing, in other words. When it comes to electricity, we have two markets, wholesale and retail. The law of economics apply to the wholesale markets, and that's where they stop. The law of politics apply to retail markets. Why is that? You know that. Okay, so I won't belabor the obvious. The reality is, because of this bifurcation of reality, by eliminating economics, not just from the classroom, but from the rate cases that occur, we have put ourselves in a quandary where in the state of California, the load factor is around 55% and projected to decline. For the U.S. as a whole, the load factor is under 60% for the electric utility industry. Look at these other industries I was talking about. The load factor is 80% or higher. Okay? So we are paying a huge price for that in higher flat rates, but nobody talks about it. It's hidden away. That's the reality. We are all paying more because of that unutilized capacity. All those combustion turbines sitting idle to run for 100 to 200 hours a year and idle for the other 8,400 hours. We are paying for that. They didn't come from Mars, right? They didn't come from the other reality. We all collectively pay for them. They are in our rates every month, every day, every year. Okay. Now, if you look at something that the utility planners call the load duration curve, which is actually a very simple concept, what you do is you take the 8760 hours of the year, you take the loads in each of those hours, you rank order them from the highest to the lowest. It's a load duration curve. It shows you how long a particular level of load is lasting. So if you look at the top 1% of the hours, so that would be less than 100 hours, they account not just for 1% of the load, but for 8 to 10% of the load. That's the expensive, really expensive cost to serve portion of the load. And right now, today, it's being priced at the same flat rate as the least expensive portion of the load. Each of those hours has a different cost to serve. With flat rate pricing, you ignore that completely. You put a blanket on it and you hide it. So the customer who is consuming mostly in the off-peak hours should be paying less, as opposed to the customer who has a large mansion and runs all kinds of air conditioners during the peak hours. Today, they're paying the same flat rate. Is that fair? Is that equitable? Is that appropriate? At least I would say no to all of those. But by doing all of those today, we are saying yes to all of those no questions. Okay? So what we have is there's a prospect, there's an opportunity to change it through dynamic pricing. All it does in a one-sentence description is it is pricing the hours based on the cost of producing the load in those hours. Okay? There are several forms of dynamic pricing. The simplest one is the parking meter rate, called the time of use rate. Okay? Peak is more expensive, so maybe noon to 6 every day is more expensive than all the other hours. Peak, off-peak. For those of you who've been around, I guess, for a few decades like me, you may remember the black rotary dial phones as opposed to these sophisticated phones with the buttons and what have you. You might remember AT&T was the only provider of phone services. And you had evenings were less expensive and nights were even more less expensive. Okay? You recall the family and friends rate, all kinds of concepts were used. The idea has been around. Everybody understands it. It's just that in electricity pricing, it remains an area where nobody wants to go, and we will get into why. So time of use is the simplest approach. The rate is fixed ahead of time. The calendar everybody is able to understand, except for maybe 2 people, and even those today are provided with magnets on the fridge that tell you peak is this, off-peak is that. Okay. But even new little signaling devices called energy orbs that change color to remind you of when the peak and off-peak occur, should you be so disposed and want to get those. They're out there. Then there's critical peak pricing. So critical peak pricing is just a time of use rate, except that it targets those top 1% of the hours that are very expensive, as I mentioned earlier. And so the rate in those top 100 hours is much, much higher. It reflects the full cost of meeting that load. Running that combustion turbine, the peaking generation plant that sits idle, its cost is being recovered when it's running. It's not being recovered when it is not running. Okay? So that's critical peak pricing. And I'll have some graphs to point that out. And then you have something called the peak time rebate. So that actually has been developed. It's a very clever invention by a person who some of you might know, Chris King, who's with eMeter. And it was developed to deal with this huge problem that we run into, that you put a critical peak pricing rate in front of the regulatory bodies and the consumer advocates, and they just look at the high price. They forget that the price in the other hours is lower. They just say, oh, you're going to charge me $1 a kilowatt hour. I said that at one meeting of some senior executives, and one person just looked at me and said, why don't you just shoot the customer? How do you respond to such a question? I mean, there is no response possible. The reality is that customer who is consuming power at that level is paying 10 cents, let's say, when it's costing the utility to $1 to serve him or her. And so all of the other customers are paying the other 90 cents. Is that fair? I mean, basically you're spreading it over the other people. You're shooting them instead of that person. And shooting being used here as a metaphorical concept. So variable peak pricing, this is now realizing the fact that each hour costs differently. And so instead of fixing the price in those high hours at a single number, it recognizes the price is fluctuating. But only in those 100 hours does the price fluctuate in real time. Just like the airline fares will fluctuate. You might check the website now, and an hour later the fare might be different. It has moved. That's variable peak pricing. And then you have real-time pricing, which is it is going to fluctuate for all of the hours of the year. So in a regular non-leap year, that's 87, 60 hours. Every 4th year, you'll have another 24 hours to add to it. So it just fluctuate depending on what the market conditions are. So then comes this issue of one part or two part. Actually, one part is what we pay all the time. One part doesn't need, and it's like pros. Okay? The interesting one is the two part. So the two part says, you may not want to have all of your consumption at the dynamic price. You may be risk averse. Maybe you only want to expose yourself so much to price volatility. Okay? So half of my purchases I'm going to lock up in a flat rate, and the other half I will have as the variable. That's the two-part rate. And the purpose simply is to insulate the customer from risk. In the extreme case, if you insulate yourself 100% from the market, then you have a one-part flat rate. That's what we have today. Now, the interesting thing is those customers who want to play the market and who have shiftable load do not have a choice. So the concept of a two-part rate is designed to go in that direction and to start giving them choices. And as you can well imagine, you can combine these rates. Just like adjustable rate mortgages come in many flavors, you can combine them in all kinds of ways. And now, how long will it be fixed? What's the loan amount? What's the duration of the loan? All of those are parameters. You can create pretty much any mortgage now that you want. So also with the dynamic price, all kinds of combinations are possible. Okay. Now, the slides obviously will be available to you. They will be on the website. So these charts are really for reference. This is what a critical peak pricing rate looks like. It has that spike, but it's lower than all the other hours. And then you have summer on the left side, winter it could just be a flat. It depends on the situation at hand. These are 24 hours. You would obviously repeat that for 8760. And keep in mind that the critical peak, the big spike, will only occur on 10 days or something like that. All the other days, it will be really a low number. And if you were a customer of PG&E, which some of you might be, there's a rate out there called the smart rate that they have, which is basically this type of a rate. And just for the record, I am on that rate. Okay, now you can combine the critical peak pricing rate, which only occurs on 10 days, you can combine it with the time of use rate. So you have an everyday time of use rate, and then you have on certain days, it rises. And by the way, the more the volatility in the rate, more volatility there is in the rate, the more you will save. That's just how it plays out. But you still have to have some ambition in life. You've got to be willing to try the new. And a lot of people hesitate because they don't know what this will do to them. Some people imagine they'll have to live next to a laptop and regulate their thermostat every second of the day. Now, I imagine there are a few people like that, but most of us will probably not want to do that. And this is not the intention here. I mean, the intention simply is to send a signal to be fair and equitable. If you want to shift, great. If you don't want to shift, you want to pay the full freight, by all means, run that air conditioner. You might be paying 25 cents a kilowatt hour if you're running it, but at least now you know what it costs. Peak time rebate, it's a nosedive, doesn't change your rate. It just says, we have one of those events now. It's a critical situation for the power grid. So if you were to cut your load, we're going to pay you money to cut your load. Okay? So it comes across as a bribe to some people. I've been told in at least one country that this would never be allowed. My hands would be cut off. So, there are scenarios in which you have to be, you have to pitch it the right way. Okay, so those are the various rate options out there. And now let's step back in time. So this is 2012. This is 2009 that I'm showing you. A projection was made by the FERC staff, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC. And just for full disclosure, I helped them make the projection. We were part of a team of consultants, so somebody doesn't come back to me. But this report was filed with the U.S. Congress. Okay. And it was required by law. There was a law, Energy Independence and Security Act 2007, that asked the FERC to do a state-by-state assessment of the potential for demand response. What is demand response? Demand response is what we have been talking about. But just to give you a more serious definition, demand response says that when prices move up in the market because there's a shortage, customers have an opportunity, a price signal, or other technology means to lower their load. In other words, demand will respond to the pending shortage of supply, preventing that shortage from becoming catastrophic in the form of a blackout. Okay? So the whole purpose of demand response is twofold: to prevent blackouts, number one, and secondly, to lower the average cost by not having those idle generating units. So demand response, broadly defined, right now, the number in the U.S. is 4%. So 4% of our peak in the U.S. collectively, and the U.S., as you know, is a huge biggest market in the globe. So if you're looking back at the year 2009, I believe the number was something like 767 or one of those airplane endings. It had, those were the gigawatts. A gigawatt is 1,000 megawatts. And so 4% was the capability. And if you did nothing else and you assume the 4% would continue for the next 10 years, then the impact of demand response would be 38 gigawatts, which is the 4% held constant. Now, parts of the country have demand response today. The two coasts have it. And then you have the Midwest, which has a little bit, but a good chunk of the Midwest has no demand response. And a good chunk of the South doesn't have demand response. That's just the way it is. I will not get into that discussion. It is a whole culture-laden discussion as to why in some areas, if I bring this up, they say, oh, that's what California does, and they have other choice words for California. I mean, the reality is there are certain cultural issues. Well, you know, I talked to a person, and they said, this is the South. We have Southern comfort. We are not going to interrupt our customers. So you have this whole issue of culture and politics and economics coming in. And if you look at the map, I don't have that map here, you will see the clear pocket. But in this scenario, we assumed what would happen if you spread demand response uniformly across the 50 states. And so it was finally the United States. Okay? Then what would you get is you would get an impact of 9%. You would get 82 gigawatts. Okay? And all you've done is just spread the current programs. Okay? And then you have now the blue line, which is if you are smart and you put in smart meters and you do the smart grid, you get all of that extra capability. Well, then what do you get? Well, then it will go up to 14%, is what we're calling achievable participation. That means something like 60 to 80% of the customers are participating in these programs, which clearly is a lot more than what we have today. But it's certainly achievable based on what other industries have. I mean, in the airline industry, 100% are doing these programs. Every flyer is on one of these programs. Even if they buy a flat rate or dynamic rate, they are part of that milieu. In our industry, I'll show you, it's really very, very low. And then the last line assumes universal. It's like universal health care, controversial. So universal dynamic pricing, equally controversial, but that won't prevent me from putting it up there. So if we did it, if we had the smart grid, we get a 20% reduction. Okay? So in much of this talk, I'm going to focus now on that 20% case, just to expand the possibilities, right? And just to imagine what the future could be like. A lot of it is about imagination. Yeah.
This came out, there's a section that breaks it down into a component based on regulatory and rate criteria, and then another on technology. Could you expand on how you segmented that?
So basically the question is regulatory versus technology. And so we have abstracted from those in this projection. I will get more into those as I get into the discussion, but come back to it because they both are intertwined. I mean, but I will make one side comment, which is that I think for those of you who are in the industry, who have been following the industry, you know that half of the country roughly has regulated markets, and the other half has what are called organized markets. Now, organized markets mean that there is a transmission system operator like PJM or the Midwest ISO or the California ISO, in which there's a structured wholesale market. And in those markets, in many of those markets, retail customers have a choice of providers. Like Texas, there is no regulated supply at all. If you've been to Texas, you know somebody in Texas, they have a choice of 192 pricing and other products that the retailers are putting out there. Now, in much of Europe, it is like that. In much of Australia, it is like that. In the U.S., half of the country has that choice, the other half doesn't. These issues transcend that, and I'll talk about Texas too. And sometimes, actually, ironically, the more competitive markets are doing less in this area than the more regulated markets. It's just something unique to our industry. We'll get more into it. It's a very important issue. I don't want to lose it.
Just to put it in perspective on this slide, 188 gigawatts, would that be covering the entire Bay Area or?
No, this is U.S. national.
I understand. I said for Bay Area.
Oh, the Bay Area?
Consumption, how many gigawatts?
What is the size? So is it 188 covering the Bay Area?
Is that large enough to cover the entire Bay Area?
Several times over. Several times over. I mean, California itself is somewhere in the range of 60 to 70 gigawatts. All of California with its 37 million customers. California is about 12% of the U.S. market. So, I mean, the Bay Area is, in terms of just the people, it's about, 3 or 4 million people, population-wise, if I remember correctly. So, in California, the load on average is about 1.22 kW per customer. And so the 3 million people you have here, obviously a meter applies to one household. So if you assume roughly 2 people, so the Bay Area is very, very small. But the reality is, if you were to ask a question that you haven't asked, but I will ask, if you were asking me, does the Bay Area today, with all its advanced technology and universities and high level of intellectual input, how much dynamic pricing is there in the Bay Area? I think that would be a good question to ask. Let's save that to the end. See, I also provide questions. He did warn you. He did warn you. Okay. So coming back to the script here, this chart shows the breakdown of each of those targets into the program types. And since we are talking today about dynamic pricing, I want to draw your attention to the blue color and the light blue color that are visible on the right two bars. And now you'll see why I wore this particular jacket. The colors match that. So what you have today, we have demand response of 4%. That's the bar on the very left. There's almost no blue color. Okay? Only 1% of the customers today in the United States, I'm talking about residential and small commercial industrial customers, only 1% have dynamic pricing. And most of them have the simplest form of dynamic pricing, which is time of use pricing. So as industries go, on a scale of 1 to 10, where 10 being the most intrepid and 1 being the most timid, where would you place our industry? Don't answer, just a rhetorical question. Okay? So there are certainly some issues that really have to be dealt with, or we will never see the reality. The last one assumes that we have now become very intrepid. Okay? And so you can see how the bar, which was 4%, now rose to 20%. That's the opportunity that we are ignoring by not doing dynamic pricing. Actually, I'll show you charts and graphs. These are hypothetical, but I'll show you from actual pilots and projects that this is real. It's not just a concoction, as somebody said to me at a conference. I was waiting for this comment to be made. Yeah.
I think at this point, if you can remind people of some of the numbers you came up with in the Power of 5% article on how sensitive the marginal cost of electricity is to the percentage of the peak.
That's okay. So the question was, how sensitive is the cost of electricity to the pricing at peak, the issue of dynamic pricing? And so we did an article back in the year 2007. It was called The Power of 5%. Okay? And all it did was it tried to show what we would save as a nation if we just clipped 5% of the peak. Okay? Beyond the 4% we already have, another 5%. And the value was $35 billion. Okay? Nothing to sneeze at. But, it certainly, that article has been cited over and over again and energized a whole industry. The demand response industry pays homage to that article every time a conference occurs. It was an article that had the most simplest of analysis you could have done, almost the back of the envelope. But that's what it shows. It's sort of like looking in a different direction and seeing the customer as a resource as opposed to the customer as a load. Okay? The challenge we have with an industry, we call the customer a load. No other industry does that, but that's what we do. So if we start thinking of the customer as a real customer who consumes products and services and not a load on the utility, then we begin to see that there are huge opportunities. We can engage with the customer as a human being and not as a load. Now, some of the more advanced utilities call the customer a meter. Okay? But that is an improvement, but we still have a ways to go. Okay? This is, again, as I said, I'm from the industry. My dad worked in the industry. I've seen it in all its incarnations, and we're still struggling. I was in Hong Kong just 2 weeks ago. Same issues, same challenges. I was in Australia. Wherever you go, the utilities regard the customer as a load. Okay. So the value was $35 billion, and I'll show you a more updated number in a couple of moments. Now, here is the interesting part. So when I first started to look at dynamic pricing, it wasn't called dynamic pricing. It was called time of use pricing. And the year was 1979. Okay. Jimmy Carter, some of you might remember, was the President of the United States. In 1978, a law was passed that had a horrible acronym that some people think rhymes with burp. It's called PURPA. So PURPA said, among many other things, that you will do time of use pricing. Okay? And it tried to introduce it. So the whole industry was abuzz with time of use pricing. Okay? It came and went. The wave crashed. It was all over. And then came the California energy crisis, which I'm sure some of you remember very fondly, right? Blackouts in February when we don't have a peak load problem. I mean, interesting things were happening. So in that time, the PUC started hearings and did a lot of discussions. Dynamic pricing was born in the crucible of that crisis. And what was interesting was a lot of the experts who were around said, you don't need to worry about the residential customers. Only 1 kW per customer, 1.5 kW per customer. Who wants to deal with them? There are only, like 300 million of them in the country. Who wants to deal with them? It's much easier to deal with the large industrial and commercial customers. You can just take them to town and get them to pay what they should be paying. But don't mess with the small customers. Who wants a revolt? Right? Everybody remembers the French Revolution, with fondness. And so, no guillotines, please. Just stay away from the residential. Well, interestingly enough, what we found was the biggest opportunity is in residential. And I'll show you a graph from Texas where that will become even more clear. Because Texas is the land of oil and gas. Texas is where the real industry is humming. And you would think in Texas, oil and gas would be king. Well, when it comes to electricity, that is not the case. Let me save the numbers for that slide that's coming up. So here in this chart, I'm just showing you the huge role that residentials can play. That's the lower end of the charts. So that was done in 2009. It's been 3 years. So we decided in 2010, a year after that, to do a survey of experts to see if there were any new thinking. And we said, don't talk about potential impact. Everybody's tired of hearing what the potential is. They begin to think of the laws of thermodynamics and so on. Let's get down to reality and say what is likely to happen. Okay? So we talked to 200 experts. 150 of them chose not to respond, right? A typical survey challenge. Even though I knew them personally, I pinged them repeatedly with emails and reminders and threats. All I got was 50 responses. But, one for each state, that's not bad. 50 experts talking. They span a whole lot of backgrounds, some utility folks, some academics. Some might be in the room, some might be listening, some might be have insulted. If I have, I'm sorry. So the reality is we got a lot of good information from the experts. Okay? And what they told us was we asked them to predict the impact of demand response. Okay? Just focus on demand response. We also asked them about energy efficiency, save that for another talk. So they said by the year 2020, demand response could reduce peak demand by 7.5% to 15%. That was overall for all sectors, and then you have the different results by sector. And see how the residential sector is in the 4 to 15% range. Now, those were the opportunities, right? That was the outlook. And so where are we today? Well, the metering industry is abuzz with action. Some of you might be from that industry. There are a lot of those folks around here in the Silicon Valley. And, sales are brisk. Business has never been as good as it is now. When I had an accidental encounter with Jerry Brown at a wedding just after he had been elected and before he had become governor, I found an opportunity to chat with him for a few minutes. Just an abrupt encounter. My wife pushed me in front of him, said, you talk to him. So I wasn't sure what to ask him. So I said, what will be your energy policy? And he said, that's too broad of a question. Well, what specifically do you mean? Okay. So I said, good. So then I said, well, how about smart meters? Jerry just flinches a little bit. Do you sell smart meters? I said, no, but I analyzed them. So he said, oh, okay. So I said, well, what's your view on smart meters? He said, I think they're a good thing. So 33% of the U.S. households, and there was a lot more to that conversation that I can't get into right now. It was all of 5 minutes, but he was really open. So 33% of the households are on smart meters today. So we have about 120 million households in the U.S. That's a lot of households.
Why is it only 33%?
What's a smart meter?
No, why is it only 33%?
There are a lot of munis and co-ops that haven't moved to smart meters yet, and that's a significant percent. There are many small ones, but they add up to being a significant fraction.
Actually, I couldn't hear the question. Would you mind repeating it?
Yeah, the question was that why only 33%?
Oh, because we started with 0% just a few years ago. So just think of it. They are putting 10,000 meters a day in some of the utilities. I mean, they're going flat out, and you're also running into shortages of meters. So part of it is just that issue, but I'll tell you why not 100%. Even if technologically it was possible to do it, a lot of the consumer advocates and commissions have all of these issues with the smart meters. I'll touch upon them briefly. I don't want that to dominate the conversation, but there are concerns that somehow we will end up paying for something that we didn't need, number one. Number two, that we'll pay for something that will become obsolete the day it's put in. And number three, that even if those two are not correct, that these meters will kill us. So, and then it just gets better from that point on. So the reality is, it is really like Monty Python. I mean, you asked a profound question, and I cannot give you an easy answer in 2 seconds. I actually have a YouTube that I'm not going to show, but I'll show you a link. This person now has 1.7 million hits, and he is Mr. Anti-Smart Meter in that video. So you will comment. So within a decade, though, this train is moving fast. This is a fast-moving train, and we are going to have in about 5 years 50%, and within a decade, probably every house will have a smart meter. Okay? Politics notwithstanding. On the other hand, though, the whole purpose was partly to put the smart meters so you don't have to read them manually. That's a big cost saving. Another purpose was so you would know when the power goes out, where it went out. You wouldn't have to dispatch the trucks, which costs a lot of money, and many other benefits like remote, when a new customer moves and you don't have to send a person. You can just remotely connect them, things like that. But the reality is the other reason for putting them in was to have the smart prices, right? As a commissioner from the District of Columbia, Rick Morgan, a former commissioner, put it, what's the point of having smart meters with dumb rates? So you need both, right, to get the most out of the investment. But right now, we have 1% on time-based rates, and only 1% of that 1% are on true dynamic pricing rate. So the last time we did the math, it was 0.01%. So flat rate pricing, which we love dearly, based on our reveal preference, because that's all we ever want to do, by the way, is not inexpensive. It is expensive. Under flat rate pricing, you have customers who are flatter than average in their load profile, who don't use much during the peak, paying more than they should be paying. And you have customers who are using a lot at the peak, paying less than what they should be paying. So what's happening? One group is subsidizing the other group. We have estimated the value of that subsidy for the U.S. as a whole at $3 billion a year. Okay? Every year, that's happening. Okay? And that doesn't stop there. Then comes this big issue, the power of 5% that Irfan talked about. So what I did now was I've done the power of 20%. Okay? Because that was the scenario we had, was a 20% scenario. Yes, Andy?
Residential only, or is that residential, or is that all?
So that was just residential. That was just residential. So the question was whether that subsidy was residential. Yeah, I just zeroed in on the residential. A good chunk of the country, the large customers have mandatory time of use rates, but there are still chunks that don't. And I continue to be surprised. I go, I won't name the states, so you have mandatory time of users for the large customers. No, we don't. I said, why not? And the answer always is, we are not California. That seems to be something that my business card seems to evoke. So if you save the 92 gigawatts, the 20%, the cost every year is $7 billion. Okay? So we add those together, roughly $10 billion a year of either inequity or inefficiency every year. Okay? Nobody talks about it. Nobody's writing editorials about it, but that's the reality. Okay? So, as some of you may have read the play by Samuel Beckett, Waiting for Godot, that's what we have here. We are waiting on a train platform, waiting for the train or the horse to come in. We don't know what it is, but we're calling it Godot. Now, some people have said that Godot has metaphysical meanings, and some have said it might mean God. Okay? I'm not going to go there, right? But the reality is our train is also stuck at the station because of 3 fears. Usually one is enough, but we have 3. Okay? Like a triangulation of fears. So the first one is about the meters. I already talked about that. They're expensive. Why should I pay for that? I was just last week at a Goldman Sachs annual power and utility conference. They asked me to speak not on dynamic pricing, but on the future of demand growth in the U.S. industry. The recession, as you know, has caused a drop in demand, and the question is, how long is this going to last? Not that I know, but they asked me anyway, so I went. Okay? So at that conference, obviously, I touched on dynamic pricing and smart meters. No sooner had I done that I was sort of identified as a target. Okay? So then I get off, and a person comes up to me and says, I live in Ohio. They just put a smart meter on my house. I didn't ask for it. I want it to be removed. I'm going to remove his smart meter. That was news to me. But, I mean, the reality is, I said, so what do you have against the smart meter? He said, I don't want to pay for it, because what does it do for me? I'm not on a time of use rate. I want a time of use rate. They don't give me a time of use rate. I said, give me the name of your utility. I'll write it down, issue a ticket. You know, not offering a time of use rate. But I didn't say that. But the reality is, that person didn't know why he was paying for it. So I said, okay, even if you don't have a time of use rate, that meter is eliminating meter reading costs. You know, all of the benefits I recited to that person. He was convinced that this was a good thing. The utility had forgotten to tell him. I mean, that's what you were seeing happen, is these $2 a month, $4 a month charges for something that you're not even sure what it's for. Right? On my own bill, recently I saw something very interesting. Some of you may have not noticed if you have on-bill pay. But most people are not checking their bill. They're just paying the check. Okay? So once in a while, I have to check it just to see what's new and innovative. And it has, as you know, if you've seen the PG&E bill, right? The PUC has to approve it. Many parties have to look at it. Finally, a bill comes out, right? And nobody wants to look at that bill. But some of us are paid to look at it. So I look at the bill. And, you know, all the charges were standard that I've seen for years, you know. There's the generation, transmission, distribution, competitive transition charge dating back to the crisis, all kinds of interesting, all of them I knew, but then there was a new item. I said, aha, the bill's new and different. Not new and improved, but new and different. And $100 was sitting next to that charge. Now, I live out in the East Bay, in Danville. Hot summers, we keep the air conditioner low, so we have high bills. But $100 for something that was called a conservation investment mechanism or something like that. Okay? So then it said, and for definitions of these terms, go back to the inside of the first page. So I went there, and of course all the definitions were there except one for this term. Life continues to evolve, so I'm going to call the 800 number and start from there. But all I'm saying is, people don't know, and if they don't know, they get frustrated. I kind of know what it is. I won't say what it is. I think I know what it is. It's the tiered rate, and it's probably the issue there. But the reality is, even a $2 charge irritates people. So a $100 charge, it hasn't been discovered yet. Just imagine, just wait till that headline appears. Okay, so meters are expensive. They're harmful to health. They violate privacy, and they compromise cybersecurity. That's why we have the fear of meters. If you've been to Sonoma County, northern Sonoma County, probably have seen signs say no to smart meters. Yeah, there's even websites and all kinds of horrible things happening to people who put the smart meters in their house. You wouldn't want to see it at night. Okay. Second, customers won't respond to dynamic pricing, we are told. Why? Because it is a necessity. Food, of course, is a necessity, probably more so than electricity, and food has seasonal variations in prices, and people respond to that. Well, but for some reason, for electricity, is enshrined. And third is the opposite of the second, that customers will over-respond in order to save money, and they will endanger their good health. I've been told in conferences by lawyers who are speaking with me that customers who are medically, connected to devices, when the price rises dynamically, they will unplug their device. So, I mean, you have to wonder, how do they cross the street, right? I mean, they've got to have, something going for them.
No, I could understand for that particular case, is that if I really need some device to help me continue to live, maybe I would rather die for lack of quality of life. But not for saving electricity bill.
Well, how much would you say? What's your life worth? $2? I mean, that's all you're going to say. So these fears, of course, are as old as time itself. I've been hearing them since the beginning of my career, as I said. Okay? Now, those who are senior to me in the profession, when I was starting as a young kid, said to me that they've been hearing these forever. Okay? And the good news is, for a long time, we didn't have empirical evidence. Empirical evidence to address the fears, and now we do. We have had, in the last decade, more than 100 experiments in 3 continents, and those give us the empirical evidence that none of these horrible scenarios have come to pass. We have more than 200,000 to 300,000 customers on these rates, and not a single person has died because of time of use rates. or dynamic pricing rate. Not recorded. I'm sure if they had, that issue would have been brought up. People are rational. People make their decisions, and people, live their lives. So here is the data from some of those experiments, and I'll just give you the high-level highlights because I guess we're in a bit of a time squeeze. What would you recommend?
I want to check the online people. They've been eerily quiet.
So I just want to make sure that everyone is doing okay on the webinar. So let me see. Oh, wow, look at all these questions that they have come up with. So we'll have a whole bunch of them to ask.
We'll be here till midnight.
Yes. So the reason you are not able to hear the comments in the room, and that's why we're repeating the questions. We're having Dr. Faruqui just say the questions so that you hear what the audience is saying, because our AV system in the room is not connected to the phone directly. And even with amplification, it doesn't make it through the speaker of the phone. So that's why you're not missing anything. Everything is being repeated. And then could you repeat the audience comments for online folks to hear? So that's what we've been doing. And then, okay, and then we'll save these for the Q&A. I just wanted to make sure there were no emergencies. And I don't
they are connected.
I don't see any emergencies, so we're good.
Hopefully nobody unplugged their medical device.
That's right.
Okay, so, I guess the moral of the story is that objections and fears have prevented what otherwise is a good thing from happening because it has been demonized. And, if it doesn't raise your bill, it's going to kill you. I mean, it's like, give me a better choice. Those two don't sound particularly attractive. Now, this is an area in which I have to say psychology has come into the equation. And so far, in the court of public opinion, if you were to sample randomly 100 people, I don't know which way the score is going to go. In other words, people who believe in the fears probably outnumber the people who don't believe in the fears. Now, Judith has another position, but I can tell you that most people right now don't have strong opinions, but those who do have very strong and negative opinions. The people who have very strong and positive opinions, other than people like me and Judith, are very few and far between. So we haven't done a good job, I think, in getting the word out. Now imagine if the airlines or the hoteling business or the car rental business had this kind of a situation, where would they be, right? They would be down to a 60% load factor. We'd be all paying more for it and probably feeling good about it, that they didn't try to do dynamic pricing to us, okay? I mean, but the reality is we are the same human beings who do all of those other things, but when it comes to electricity, it suddenly changes. I was even told at one conference in New Mexico by the chair of a prominent Public Utilities Commission who was chairing the session, and he knew I was going to be the first speaker, and he said he's going to talk about something called time-of-use pricing. And he said, the last time I tried to bring that up at my house, my wife said she would divorce me. Okay. So I got up there, and I said, you're probably going to get a divorce anyway. Why are you going to blame it on the time-of-use rate? I mean, what else are you going to say? I mean, it's like, give me a break here. Not a convenient excuse. So, okay, so what we have, I'm approaching 60, so I can say a few things. So what we have here is, on the horizontal axis, is the price ratio, peak to off-peak. Okay? That's measuring the intensity of the signal. Okay? Obviously, a ratio of 2 to 1 is strong, but a ratio of 8 to 1 is stronger. So the stronger the signal is, the more the incentive to shift the load. Okay? And on the vertical axis is the amount of load that is being reduced at peak times. So we have 43 observations there from 43 experiments from around the globe. A lot of them in the US, but some from Canada, some Australia, some Europe. And you get this arc. And the arc shows that as you dial up the peak to off-peak price ratio in these experiments with real people, some were high income, some were low income, some had medical issues, some was a normal cross-section of the populations from which they were drawn. These were random samples. Yes, sir? Yes, all residential, yeah.
COU or event driven? COU across the year or event driven?
So they had a combination. They had a combination of rates. And that's kind of where the geographies kind of come into play. But what we did was we just abstracted them and converted them into a peak to off-peak ratio. So we could do some comparisons. And then you have some experiments in which they brought in smart thermostats that automatically adjust to the higher prices and raise the setting by a couple of degrees on those really hot days. And a couple of degrees for a few hours doesn't really make anyone really uncomfortable, but it really raises the amount of responsiveness you get. So this is with automation. So this is automation and pricing, and the previous chart was just pricing by itself. On the previous chart, I went in the wrong direction. The previous chart, people are manually making the adjustment. And by the way, it is not just air conditioning which they're adjusting. They're also maybe turning off some lights, turning off some appliances, moving or rescheduling their laundry and what have you. And then you come to the automation. So this is where technology is coming in. This is more of a digital house or a smart house. We don't have the perfect smart house today. If we had it, the responsiveness would be even higher. So the load drops you're seeing are in the, so a representative price ratio is 8 to 1. This is the critical hours, just the top 100 hours, 8 to 1 price ratio, and what that would do is a drop of about 15% would occur in your peak load without technology. Okay? It has been demonstrated in these real experiments with hundreds of thousands of customers. And if you had technology, it would bump up to 22 to 25%. Okay? So those are some of the results. And by the way, as the French say, the more things change, the more they stay the same. I've also got the French there. I dare not pronounce it. But the reality is, when I was early in my career, the PERPA legislation had passed, and 16 experiments had been conducted in the U.S., including one in Puerto Rico. And we took the 5 best experiments from that sample. I was at EPRI at the time, the Electric Power Research Institute in Palo Alto. And we developed a model that collected the data from those 5 different experiments. One was Connecticut, one was North Carolina, one was in Wisconsin, and 2 were in California, both in Southern California, one in Los Angeles and another one in the areas around Los Angeles. And the kind of arcs we have from back then are so similar to the arcs we have now. The black arc, the solid black, is what I showed you in the previous chart for price only, and these others are from 1982. Okay? So consumers of electricity living their normal lives continue to demonstrate the obvious truth that they are price responsive just like they are for any other product. And so yes, electricity is a necessity, but it doesn't mean that they will always buy the same amount regardless of the price. Okay. So now comes this other issue, which is the low-income customers. And the concern has been expressed, and this is why the train is still at the station, that the folks who represent the low-income groups during the hearings, during the regulated proceedings, and in the debate that Bert Hobby actually was in the back there, moderated at the University Club. The other person that I was debating was Mark Toney, who is Dr. Mark Toney, and he is the, Judith Schwartz actually moderated the debate, and Bert Hobby introduced the panel. I stand corrected. and what we had, you might want to raise your hand just so people see. Okay. And Irfan was one of the discussions. So in some sense, we are reliving, what was probably a somewhat interesting but mostly agonizing situation because you didn't know where it would go, right? I think it had a good outcome. We got a lot of people to agree that yes, there is a perception that low-income customers would be worse off, but in reality, if you think about the typical low-income dwelling versus, let's say, the non-low-income dwelling, it has fewer appliances. It may not even have an air conditioner. It may have a room air conditioner. It may have fans. Okay? So they are at home a lot, but their load is relatively flat. They're not peaky like the high-income customers are. So what we found in the data from this one utility, we plotted out the impact on your bill if you were participating in a dynamic pricing rate. It was a CPP rate, a critical peak pricing rate. And the blue line shows the distribution of bill changes for the sample as a whole. So that includes everyone, average income, low income, high income, everyone. Okay? So about 60% of the people have a lower bill, and the other 40% have a higher bill. If they don't do anything, that's just how the impacts would roll out. If they are low income, then the line is the red line. And now you have almost 80% of the low income folks having a lower bill. That's the very opposite of what most people expect. They expect, if you go to the rate cases, the AMI business cases, the regulatory hearings, the concern is it's going to wipe them out. No, it's actually, they are overpaying now. 80% of them are paying more today. They just don't know it. Okay. And then, of course, if you show that chart, then they say, oh, but they can't respond. So this chart deals with that data. It's drawn from a whole bunch of pilots that are listed at the bottom, ranging from California to Connecticut, and including Baltimore and Washington, D.C., and Hydro-Quebec in Canada. And the average customer response is 100%. So in each pilot, we're comparing the response of the low-income customers to the sample as a whole, average. And I think about 2/3 would be a reasonable number to derive from this chart. That yes, low-income customers respond less, but they still respond quite a bit, maybe about 2/3 of the average customer's response. So the perception that they don't respond implies they would have a zero response, and that's not true.
Maybe the reason why they respond less is because they don't have any equipment.
That's correct.
The load factor, you say it's already less as it is.
They're already pretty flat, and they have less load, so there will be less responsiveness, and you would expect it. But even then, they still respond. It's not that they are not playing in the game. And my hypothesis is that $1 saved for a low-income customer carries more weight than $1 saved for a middle income or certainly a high-income customer. So they have motivation, and that's why they still respond. So in other words, they are behaving just like we would expect anyone to behave who's price sensitive. I mentioned this video, and if you go to that link, you will find that video of this person trying to tell you that this is the worst thing that ever came about was the smart meter. So this is an anti-smart meter video. All I can say is I was in Molokai on vacation last year and on a tour, and somebody asked the tour guide, so we see a lot of development taking place. This is progress, and do you like it? I asked the tour guide who's a native, and obviously, they don't like it. But this person gave an interesting response. His response was, progress is inevitable. The best that some of us can hope to do is to delay it. Okay. So I'm not commenting on Molokai. I'm just saying that's a nice metaphor that applies. So that person is pushing hard to stop it, but it's coming. As I said, 33% already have it, and soon 50 and 100%. So the meters are going to come. So the question now is what to do about the prices. Prices we have in most of the country today, it's a flat rate. Now, California is flat in a time of use sense, but we have the inclining block rate that I'm sure some of you are familiar with. The more you consume, the more you pay. It has these tiers, and I think that's what the $100 thing that I have in my bill relates to. But the reality is it's still a flat from a time of use perspective. So as we look at the future, 5 years out, maybe 20 years out, maybe 10 years out, we will have meters. We will have the capability to go from a flat rate, and I showed you there's $10 billion a year of cost we are paying for the flat rate. So if we were to move everyone to a critical peak pricing rate, and then say if you don't like it, you can take one of these other options. But initially move everyone to that rate, then we stand a chance of eliminating that $10 billion loss. Otherwise, we will never get there. So people were asked, in terms of dynamic pricing, the same survey people, what do they expect will be the likely penetration of dynamic pricing? And the second bar, 8 to 20% was the prediction. Right now it's 1% or 1% or 0.01%. So I think this is a pretty optimistic survey. Maybe I talked to those people who are already predisposed. Maybe this is not really going to come to pass. But at least it's something I thought I'd share with you. Well, as Hemingway said, the sun also rises. And I've told you a lot of pessimistic stories. Let's talk about some optimistic stories. Okay? So in the state of Illinois, we have Commonwealth Edison and Ameren. They have a real-time pricing program for residential customers. They have 25,000 customers signed up for that program. Okay? Now, admittedly, there's 25,000 out of 4.5 million, so maybe not something to get excited about, but you can also compare the 25,000 to zero, and it is a lot bigger than zero. Okay? Yeah.
But Illinois as a state could also be commented as just like California. I mean, the rest of the U.S. might not be in the same category as the state of Illinois.
Yeah, I mean, Illinois certainly has much more progressive legislation, and actually they have a new law that calls for advanced metering to be rolled out and then opt-in peak time rebates to be rolled out. But it's not just, I have a few other states as well. So let's take a quick peek at California. PG&E has just hit the 60,000 mark, according to the person who gave me that number. They're on critical peak pricing rates. This summer, San Diego Gas and Electric is offering peak time rebates on an opt-out basis to all its customers, more than 1 million customers. Southern California Edison is offering peak time rebates on an opt-in basis. Then let's go to Oklahoma. Now that's the middle of the country, right? Now that is the Midwest. And that is where a lot of interesting things are happening. Their CEO, very progressive. He has a target. He wants to not build a particular power plant. He's going to use the customer as a resource, as a partner, and engage with them, recruit them into a variable peak pricing program, more advanced than CPP. How could they get ahead of California, by the way? I don't know, but somehow the folks in Oklahoma are showing us some interesting faces. So we are being told that they're going to sign up 20% of their residential customers over the next 3 years. That's going to be an eye-opener. You know, if Oklahoma can pull it off as an opt-in voluntary program. Now the catch is they're offering you a free smart thermostat. It comes with a rate. Okay? So that's obviously an attractive incentive. Then you go to the Mid-Atlantic region. So this is Washington, D.C., this is Baltimore, this is Delaware. Very soon you'll have 2 million customers over the next 5 years in Delaware, Maryland, District of Columbia. And PJM, which is a very large wholesale market operator, serving 13 states and 50 million people in the northeastern United States, is now going to allow price-responsive demand to be bid into its wholesale markets. Price-responsive demand is just taking the dynamic pricing estimates and bidding them into the marketplace. Okay. Now Texas, I had promised I'd show you something about Texas. So look at residential load. It's the green portion of the bar. On a normal day, it's 27% of the total peak load. And then on a really hot day, and they have had their share of hot days in the last couple of years, 51%. That's where there's a huge opportunity. And right now they're doing almost nothing in that market, except they have rolled out meters to all of those customers. So why are they not doing anything? Because the commission says it cannot regulate the retail rates anymore. It's a competitive state. And the retailers, you talk to them, why are they not doing it? They're saying the customers don't want it, the customers don't know what it is. So you have the perfect catch-22 of why Texas, you should comment. Go ahead.
Well, TXU has just started a program called Free Nights and Weekends. So not only it's not that it's a lower rate, it's that they're saying it's free.
They have the wind power.
That's one of the major providers. So the question was that the comment was that one of the major providers, TXU, is providing this new rate, which is essentially a time-of-use rate, free nights and weekends. And that's obviously an extreme, off-peak price of zero, essentially.
Well, CenterPoint also have opt-in, have choices too, and get a better deal with CenterPoint than Reliance.
Okay, so maybe you could elaborate more on that when.
Yeah, we also have a bigger problem in Texas. It is a free open market. You've got retailers, and you're fundamentally asking a retailer to change their business model that says, sell less of your solution to a customer. Right? So unless they figure out a market mechanism to pay that customer, you're asking a retailer to make the basis of their sale, and I'll sell you less.
So the comment was that in a sense you're asking the retailer to sell less and they make money by selling more. And the market mechanism doesn't quite have the right incentive. That's true, but if they're looking at their earnings, then if they are selling at a flat rate during those expensive hours, they're actually losing money. And I was thinking that they would figure it out, just like all of the other businesses have figured it out. But right now, I believe they're in the grip of what is known as market share frenzy. They want to get their brand established. They want to have a certain critical mass. And maybe once that has settled down and they look at the longer haul, then we might see more rational pricing. But it remains really, the state to watch. So the about
Arizona.
Oh, that's true. I totally missed Arizona. So Arizona, for those of you who have been there in the summer, is a furnace, and they have many days above 110 degrees, and that would be the last place you would expect something like this would find root. Okay. Well, and I showed you that 1% of the nation's customers are on time-of-use rates today, and of that 1% are dynamic pricing rates. But the other 99% of the 1% are on simple time-of-use rates. Well, 2/3 of those are in Arizona.
Yeah.
In Arizona Public Service and the Salt River Project.
Right. So there is a program in Arizona for prepaid that Salt River Project has been doing for a long time. Let me actually
Yes, yeah, I was going to say.
Yeah. So the statistic that Ahmad shared about Arizona has very strong reasons. There was a precursor to this whole smart meter program, and that was prepay. And Salt River Project actually did a study on their prepay customers, and they found on average that they consume 12.5% less electricity than their regular people. But as a result of prepay, they had a box. You know, they would put their smart card or whatever into it, and they were aware. They had a display that showed how much energy they were using. So they had that Prius effect going on, and it really educated not only the credit challenge people in Arizona, but just people who wanted their kids to become a little more aware of energy consumption. And it created a cultural phenomena in Arizona, and that's why you see such a disproportionate thing, because they were already up to speed on it.
Yes, so that's one element of the puzzle. But what I have to say is there are two utilities there. Arizona Public Service is the IOU, investor-owned utility, and Salt River Project. So the prepay, I believe, is mostly in the Salt River Project territory, and it requires the smart meters. But Arizona Public Service has time-of-use rates to 51% of its customers without prepay. And without smart meters, they're just a regular time-of-use meter. And here's how they do it. And by the way, they are the world leader in time-of-use pricing. They don't, talk as much about it as you would imagine that they would, but they are number one. And the lesson we learned from them is when a new customer arrives, they're given a choice of 4 rates. They're not just put on one rate, and then they have to figure out that, there are other choices. They go through a walking process over the phone. And they said we have one time-of-use rate, which is this length of the peak period. We have another time-of-use rate with a different length of the peak period. Then we have a time-of-use rate with a demand charge. And then finally you have the standard rate, which in their case is an inclining block rate, like the one we have here in California. Now, if you are a large customer, you're going to end up paying that higher tier rate if you go on the inclining block rate. And so it's an obvious incentive for them to avoid that by going to the time-of-use rate, which doesn't have the tiered rates. So they have figured out a way to create the economic incentive. It's like, look at it like this. Suppose you're looking for a mortgage. You're a new house, new mortgage. And there's a choice between a fixed-rate mortgage and adjustable rate mortgage. Okay? So you're looking at your risks and benefits. Now, if the fixed-rate mortgage costs no more than the adjustable rate mortgage, how many would take the adjustable rate mortgage? Would anyone take the adjustable rate mortgage that costs the same as a fixed rate mortgage? Nobody would, right? Why take the risk unless there's a benefit? So that's the problem with a lot of these pricing design. Why is anybody going to take them unless there is some money to be saved? And you have to tilt the diagram in such a way that they will take it. So this is my last little sequence here of how to roll it out. Okay? And I don't know what the future is going to be like. Nobody does. And if somebody does, if somebody said they should be in jail. So the reality is the best way to predict the future is to create it. Okay, that's Peter Drucker, right? So in the case of our conversation here, we have done a lot of pilots, 134 pilots when I last counted. It's already out of date. Maybe it's more than 140 now. Utilities and commissions around the country have been developing what are called business cases for advanced metering infrastructure, or smart meters. AMI is the acronym. They've done those. They have therefore proceeded to deploy at AMI. Okay, 33% already, 50% expected soon. So the metering story, despite the objections from the people who don't like them, is yesterday's story. Tomorrow's story is the pricing story. Okay? So the big question is, how should you offer these dynamic prices? So one option is do it like Arizona, do an opt-in. Let them know it's there, and they take it, they take it. Okay, Arizona is 51%, with APS 31% for Salt River Project. Okay. The rest of the country, virtually nothing, and so we have 1% as a whole. That's opt-in. The power of opt-in for the nation as a whole for this kind of pricing design is 1%. That's all we want. We just stop there. Okay. Or we do opt-out. Opt-out is like when you join a company and they have a 401k plan or something like that. They automatically do an allocation for you. Then if you don't like that default setting, you can change it. But the default is pre-programmed. In the old days, when they first introduced the program, your program wasn't even active until you signed in. You opted in. Many people forgot to do it. Okay? So they were losing the opportunity. So opt-in is known by some people as paternalistic. Some people don't like it. It's like, being told what you're going to do. But some people call it libertarian paternalism. These are the academics at the University of Chicago, right? They're going to have multiple words and a lot of syllables. But the reality is, whatever you call it, opt-out gets more participation. And the latest study on that is in Europe on organ donation. When you have opt-out, the percentage is in the high 90s. When you have opt-in, it's in the low teens. But those are the two choices. You can do both, and I'll just talk briefly about the pluses and minuses. So if you're going to do opt-in, you could leave the flat rate unchanged, and then you get the 1% answer that we have today. Or you can change the flat rate and make it more expensive. That's the APS story, and you get 51%. So do you want 51% or do you want 1%? Yeah, that's the opt-in side. It's politically easy. Then comes the opt-out, lump in the throat, hard to do, French Revolution guillotine. So now what you can do is you can do the two-part rate, and I'll describe briefly what it is, or you can do the one-part rate. So let's quickly just close with looking at this one. So if you are going to change the flat rate, then you have the opportunity to provide those customers with what are called shadow bills. A shadow bill is what you would have paid otherwise had you stayed on the old rate. And you can compare the savings. Okay? And obviously, it's a good thing to do. If you don't provide a shadow bill, they just don't know whether they came out ahead or not. Now, if you go in the opt-out sequence, then the two-part rate, as I mentioned earlier, simply says a chunk of your purchases will be at the flat rate, and then extra purchases would be at the dynamic pricing rate. So the question is, how do you set the first part? The easy way is just measure the usage of the customer for 1 year and say that's your historical usage. If that's all you consume, you will pay yesterday's rate. It's a flat rate. If you use more, then you'll pay the dynamic pricing rate. It's like a cushion, right? Or you could say for those customers who are, who don't want others telling them what their history was, just say it's up to you. How much of your purchase do you want to lock up? It's like a hedging contract. And the customer says, I'll hedge 100%, I'll hedge 50%, I'll hedge whatever percentage. You create a market mechanism. Okay? So there are various ways of doing the two-part rate. Now, if for some reason your billing system people tell you they cannot do the two-part rate, and it's amazing how much power the billing system folks have in the industry. They can sometimes stop all of these ideas with saying it can't be billed. And I say all you have to do is multiply two numbers and then multiply two other numbers and just add them. That's the two-part rate. And it's like I spent $100 million on the system. It cannot do that. I don't know how they get away with it, but it seems to be a great business proposition. In any event, that is a challenge we have to deal with. So you offer the single-part rate, and it creates fear in many customers' minds that my bill is going to double or triple, and I'll be out of work. I'll be sitting on the pavement begging. And so to prevent any of those scenarios from even entering the imagination, you say, don't worry, Mr. or Ms. Customer, we're going to give you bill protection. So we'll calculate the two bills. You'll pay the lower of the two for the first year. It's a trial period. Then in the second year, we're going to lower your bill protection. So you'll not be covered 100%, but whatever the difference was, we'll write off half of that. In the third year, we'll write off 1/10 of that, and then you phase it out. So there's a bill protection like training wheels, for learning how to ride a bike. So this is bill protection as training wheels so that customers can become comfortable with the rate concept. Okay? Or the other option is don't offer bill protection. And some of these choices are pretty easily eliminated, but basically I put all of those options there just to indicate that there is a whole bunch of references I've drawn upon. They are listed in the back. And then there's also a huge bibliography we have just created. It's about 10 pages long. And those are the scientific empirical studies that are behind this presentation that I made. So you can look at these if you want the bibliography. It will be available very soon. I guess what I could even do is perhaps send that to Irfan, and you could post it if you wanted to. And with that, I am going to stop. And thank you very much.
So what we'll do is to make use of the time. The questions that are online, we'll answer them right away before the break. And for the people in the session, stay for the networking break. And then when we reconvene for the panel discussion, you can ask your detailed questions. And that way, people who are on the East Coast, if it's getting late for them, they can go to bed. Okay, so with that, let me bring up the questions here, because there were several questions here. So the first question is from Michelle Rodriguez, who says, I have operated utility and community choice aggregation programs. It would seem that the utility long-term purchasing contracts do not allow great flexibility for dynamic pricing, whereas with the community choice aggregation programs, all launching now, could integrate dynamic pricing into the renewable energy purchase contracts. What do you think?
Well, that's very unfortunate if those programs do not allow dynamic pricing to be done. I guess I do know that this issue of long-term contracts arises many times when dynamic pricing is mentioned. Like, for example, a few years back in Ontario, I was invited to speak to the Ontario Energy Board about the same topic. And when I was done presenting, the chair of the commission said to me that you have come too late. We already signed up the long-term contract, and we have locked in how much power we're going to buy. So what is the benefit to be now derived by using less? It's a take-and-pay contract. Well, I mean, the reality is, obviously, there's nothing that can be done if you sign the contract unless there is some way for you to negotiate yourself out of the contract and rebid it and redo it. But in most cases, it's too cumbersome to do. So all I can say, on a forward-looking basis, contracts ultimately do expire. And so the next time you bid this out, tell them that you want a separate bid for the peak hours and a separate bid for the off-peak hours and a third bid for the critical peak hours. I mean, that's an idea that we have been trying out in a few areas.
How long is the long-term contract?
How long is the contract?
Yeah.
Well, it's a question of how long is the contract, and it varies. Each contract has its own terms. It could be 5 years, it could be 10 years, it could even be 20 years. The contracts that the state of California signed at the height of the crisis, when we were having blackouts, were for 20 years. We're still stuck with those contracts. They were bought at the height of the crisis, so they're very expensive. And sometimes you hedge at the wrong time. And I'm sure we have all done that in some transaction or the other. So that's the only other option is to buy it on the spot market. But that could be expensive or inexpensive. So again, that's where your risk-taking behavior and attitudes come in.
The next question is also from Michelle. She's calling in from Sonoma today. I know that. The next question from Michelle says, oh, it's a duplicate. Okay. All right, so that is all the questions we have, it seems.
I guess there were two very long questions that were identical.
Yeah. Okay. Now let me just tell you on the agenda today. We have a short ceremony before we go into our networking break. And the ceremony is a certificate giving ceremony. Not a gift giving, but a certificate giving. So I taught a class at Foothill College this last quarter, spring quarter of 2012, on smart energy systems. And several of my students are here in the room, so they've successfully completed that class, and they're going to receive certificates. Now, the significance of this course, and this is why I brought it to this forum, because this was a special course that was funded through the Department of Labor, through the NOVA program. And its purpose was to help people who in the middle of their careers are either changing their careers voluntarily or involuntarily, and they are looking at the whole smart grid, clean tech space, and they want to develop some skills. So it was this introductory class offered, and most of the people were in their mid-careers. So what I'd like to do is bring the certificates and recognize these individuals. So if you took the class, please come to the front of the room, and then I'll do a quick ceremony of where I'll pass the certificates out. So could you please, those of you who are in my class, come to the front? So we have Russell Morgan. Could you come up? Scott Melber. George Ogawa. Hannah Moyer. Dale Gutierrez.
Oh, thank you. That's me.
George Lee. Pat Fassan. Vinay Pradhan. Pradhan. Peter Lee. And we have one for Greg Chu. We have a blank one, interestingly. So we'll have to put his name on the certificate. They sent me a blank one, so I figured it was for him. But I'll shake your hand.
Oh, thanks.
But he was very deserving. He completed the formalities and submitted. So one interesting note, and you will receive your certificate. I got a blank one.
Okay.
See? It's a blank one. No, not that one. This one. This one. And I will handwrite your name on that. So it'll be special. But one of the projects that I gave them at the end of the course was to come up with this fictitious case that I created for a utility in the southwestern part of the United States that had an RPS target in the state of some 25% non-hydro renewable. And I gave them a mix of nuclear and hydro and coal and all of that. And they had to come up with a plan that they would give to the chief technology officer of the utility. They were hired as the director of smart grid. And they had to come up with a 10-year plan on how will they implement technologies and business process and work on the regulatory side to make sure that this utility can achieve those targets over a 10-year period. So that was their project. And they all wrote very nice, very creative descriptions on what they would do. And it was supposed to stay above the fray of technology. I didn't want them to say, I'm going to put this router and this switch. It was a higher level. So it was amazing in a short span of 3 months how much these students learned about the different aspects of smart grid. And I basically gave them a 50-hour oral lecture over the quarter on all the domains of the smart grid and what the issues are. So before we go into our networking break, there are some badges for you over there, so you can put them on so you can identify each other in the networking break. We're going to spend about 5-6 minutes here in the room as we put the goodies out for you in the break room, and then we'll all go over there, and we'll stay there till about 6:15, at which time we will all converge here, and then we'll have the panel discussion. And I'll let Judith kind of moderate and participate in the panel. I'll be more of an observer, and then we'll have Bonnie and Ahmad join us. So because you're showing the different aspects of this business, and I think it'll be very good for the three of you to participate. Of course, you can start by a disclaimer that you're not representing SVLG when you make your comments. So that will be fine. Okay, so very good. At this point, I'm going to stop the recording, and I will restart it in a panel discussion at 6:15 Pacific. So for those of you who are on the webinar, feel free to stay logged on, go have your dinner or whatever, and then come back at 6:15 Pacific, and we will resume at that time. So thank you very much.